We now go to Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, who served as an Air Force pilot in Afghanistan and also served with Special Operations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Appreciate your service and taking the time with us. As the Chairman mentioned in his opening remarks, I just came back from Afghanistan. Actually, we did Afghanistan and Pakistan. Pakistan is quite a complicated relationship and one that I expect will probably continue to be complicated. But, Ambassador, as you alluded to, I believe and I hope that the Pakistanis are actually starting to understand that the Taliban is actually their problem too. And it's no longer a tool they can use to posture against India or whatever went into that whole, I guess, calculus there. The one point I want to make from this is the people of Afghanistan, there's a message that has not gotten out to the United States. The people of Afghanistan are good people. The people of Afghanistan want to live in freedom. The Taliban's approval rating in Afghanistan is something like 10%. Slightly higher in Congress, but it's still about 10%, which means the Taliban are not popular in Afghanistan. This is a message that I don't think has gotten out. Karzai, and in Karzai's posturing to do whatever it is he calculates he wants to do, we met with him as well, and I got to tell you, I got a very different view coming out of the meeting one-on-one with Karzai than what I've seen in the media and what he's spouting. I see a man who said, hey, we want the United States to be here, we want a long-term relationship, and then for whatever domestic consumption he thinks he's doing, he's actually doing more harm than I think he realizes. But they're good folks. And I'm hoping that, you know, we learned our lessons from the complete withdrawal from Iraq, which was a terrible mistake, and I think is being shown all over the world as a terrible mistake. And I hope that we continue to press ahead with getting this BSA done and having a long-term commitment. A couple of quick points I want to make. As I mentioned, the Americans don't see the success in Afghanistan. I think Americans still think there's 150,000 troops that are marching up and down the hill, engaging in the Taliban, and we're taking the brunt of the casualties. The Afghan military is actually losing about 100 soldiers a week. They're taking the fight to the Taliban when they find themselves engaged. They don't have the air support that an American military has, but they're fighting very bravely. It's a completely different situation than what we saw even 2 years ago. Secondly, so that's what Americans think. My concern, I just want to put this on the record, I can't think of the last time I saw the President of the United States tell the American people why we're in Afghanistan. I can't do that. Now, I believe we're in Afghanistan for a good reason. I believe us remaining engaged in Afghanistan post-2014 is important. I can't remember the last time I've heard the President say that. The President fairly recently, went to Afghanistan and did not meet with President Karzai. I thought that was an oversight. So there's things along that line. But let me get now to my questions. We're looking at a residual force, from what I'm understanding, 9,000 to 10,000 American troops and a few more NATO troops in that process. What was General Allen's recommendation in terms of a residual force? Mr. Dumont, maybe you can answer that, or whoever.
I'm sorry, Congressman, I don't have that number off the top of my head.
Does any of you three know what General Allen recommended? Because I believe it was somewhere around 15,000 to 20,000 American troops post-2014. I say that to say I'm concerned that we're going to undershoot the amount of troops we have available in Afghanistan to do both counterterrorism and support, both in building the Afghan establishment and government, and also in supporting their troops engaged in the field. I think it would be very unfortunate for 20 years from now for us to read the history books and say that America was 5,000 troops short of actually being successful in Afghanistan. We visited the prison, Parwan prison in Afghanistan, and we visited, there's I think right now 59 TCNs in prison. Mr. Ambassador, do you have any idea, like, what are we going to do with these TCNs that we continue to have? The Afghans obviously don't want them. I wouldn't either. And now we have to figure out what are we going to do with them as we reach the post-2014. Are any of you guys familiar with that situation and have any ideas for what we do?
Well, in general, we're going to have to do something with them by the end of 2014. Some of them will be turned over to the Afghans. Some of them will be returned to the country of origin when those countries undertake to deal with them appropriately.
And let me ask one more question, just because my time's running out. So now we're into this kind of reduction posture. In fact, I think the vast majority of American forces are now focused on withdrawing instead of necessarily taking the fight to the enemy. That's unfortunate, but how do you think the offensive went against Haqqani? Do do you believe it was completed, or do you believe we're leaving too quickly to finish that fight against the Connie network? Mr. Sampler, start with you.
Thank you. I really don't have an opinion on the Connie network. I mean, I've worked in Afghanistan since 2002. They've been there decades before that. So, but I don't have any opinion on the.
It would be nice if they were gone, though, wouldn't it?
It would, Congressman. It would.
Mr. Dumont, do you have any thoughts on Haqqani?
It is something, obviously, that we take seriously and that we follow and track closely and fight against each day, and it is something we remain focused on because it is serious to us.
Thank you.
The Afghans understand that as well.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. We go now to Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, who served as an Army officer in Iraq.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Aloha. Thanks for being here, and thanks for your hard work and your service, each of you. You know, we've seen different opinions and different perspectives here today through the committee on the issues in Afghanistan. I think these conversations reflect the conversations that we hear when we go back to our districts, that we hear in the public, about why there is an overwhelming public sentiment to bring all of our troops home, is that there seems to be a lack of a clear definition on what our mission is. What is the end state that our troops are trying to accomplish there, that we are trying to accomplish there? Who is the enemy that threatens the United States in Afghanistan that our troops are fighting against? And when we say we need to accomplish the mission, what does that even mean? What does that look like? You know, when we look back to why we went there in the first place, Osama bin Laden is no longer a threat. Al-Qaeda has largely been decimated in Afghanistan. We see now, of course, pockets and threats coming from other countries and other regions from these terrorist networks. And we've also seen that because Al-Qaeda has no allegiance to a specific flag or country, that our best and most efficient way to deal with this threat is through some of the quick strike forces that we have successfully used in the past with some of these areas. You know, when we look at stability, people have talked often about stability in Afghanistan as being an end state. We've given many tools, training, infrastructure to the Afghan people, the Afghan forces, in order to attain this end state, but we also talk about the corruption, the other challenges that exist within the country, the tribal influences, which really lead us to understanding that this stability at the end can only be achieved by the Afghan people. So I've got three questions that follow kind of this structure. First is, with the bilateral security agreement, what are the next steps at this point, given what Karzai has said and his posturing in not looking at this until after the Afghan elections, and how long do we wait for him to make up his mind on what he wants to do? If eventually the bilateral security agreement is completed and agreed to, the remaining forces that are being projected to stay in Afghanistan have two missions or two purposes from what I've seen, and that is to train and assist, and also a counterterrorism element. I'm wondering what percentage of that projected, how those troops are broken up between those two missions. And lastly, with that contingent that is left in Afghanistan, I think the BSA has a kind of a 10-year timeline. What is the timeline for our U.S. presence there in Afghanistan? Is it a timeline? And if it's not a timeline, is it an end state that we are trying to achieve and say once this is achieved, then there will be no presence? So Ambassador Dobbins, if you could start really on the next steps of the BSA, and then Mr. Dumont talking a little bit about our forces there.
Okay. Well, we're there to prevent Afghanistan from again becoming a country with a government that supports Al-Qaeda and allows it free reign within that country, something the Taliban did and which they would do again if they came back to power. We believe that concluding the BSA as soon as possible is necessary to sustain the large, broad 70-nation coalition that supports Afghanistan. We believe it'll begin to fragment, and we believe the Afghan people will become increasingly anxious the longer this goes on. But we haven't, at this point, set a date beyond which we're no longer prepared to wait. We simply believe there's a big cost in waiting, and it's a cost going to be paid for by the Afghan people. I'll let Mr. Dumont comment on the relationship between the train and assist and CT elements. In terms of the timeline, the assumption is that this is going to be a declining presence over time, that whatever decision is made for 2015 will be again reviewed in the course of 2015 with the hope that the number can be reduced in 2016, et cetera. The objective over time is an Afghanistan that's capable of securing its territory and its population without more than the normal level of external assistance that countries at that level of development receive around the world.
Thank you. Mr. Dumont, quickly.
Yes, ma'am. As you know, the Train, Advise, and Assist NATO mission is to assist the Afghans to become capable force, reliable CT partner so that we don't have to do the CT, and that will take place over time. It will be a combined effort for some time, I imagine. The percentage of who will do what, I don't believe has been worked out yet. It will remain to be seen how quickly the Afghans can assume more control for the CT fight in their own country and how much assistance and support they will require from donor nations.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Ted Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate you being here. I want to build on some of the statements made by my colleague from Hawaii and Mr. Duncan in the regards of the money being spent, how much money we've spent. You were talking about $100 million for election and another $45 million for equipment for elections. And with what Ms. Gabbard was saying, what is the end game? I mean, what are we hoping for? That they'll have a stable government, one that's not wrought with fraud, waste, and abuse, and that will run a country that we can be good allies with and trading partners? Mr. Sampler, if you would. Define the end game. I mean, what are we looking to gain? I mean, for success, what would you say that is?
There's two questions, and the larger end game I'll yield to Ambassador Dobbins for. That's a policy question. With respect to the $100 million on elections, of which 45 is the bilateral part, I mean, what we're hoping for is an election that the Afghans are happy with. I mean, our goal, I get asked the question quite often, what are we doing in Afghanistan? And the answer that I use is my own. It's not government policy, but it's a secure, stable, and democratic Afghanistan that governs its population justly and secures its geographic space.
Okay.
We don't want to have to go back.
Let me stop you there. How much effective is that the ANSF right now? I mean, are they more effective? Are they standing up, and do they own the security and it's like they're fighting? They know it's theirs responsibility.
Yes, sir, they do. We have transitioned security to them. They are in the lead. They are taking the majority of casualties, and I'd venture to say close to 90% of the operations the military is conducting are Afghan-led, Afghan-directed, Afghan-planned. And some others for some unilateral CT missions that we do, it's also in conjunction with them. They do have a presence on it. They are involved in the planning, but they are doing the majority of the fighting and taking the majority of the casualties.
How much of that effectiveness is based on us being there and our presence there?
Well, to get them to the point that they're at, it's been a long-term effort, obviously.
Correct.
Now we are providing, depending on the level of the unit, for instance, their counterterrorism forces, we provide very little assistance. We have a presence there, but they are skilled, they are capable, and they are taking the fight to the insurgent threat. And their regular ANSF forces, the conventional forces, are making strides every day and making great progress. We do have an advising mission with them, but they are in the lead.
Okay. Are we looking at some point of being able to pull out altogether, or is this going to be another permanent U.S. military base around the world that we have?
I don't envision a permanent presence as you speak about. I think what it will depend on is how well progress is made, how well stability in Afghanistan is in effect over time, and how well regional stability is in effect also. I think it'll be a long-term sort of focused effort that will take review over a period of time to assess how well things are progressing and what the enduring threat is to the United States, if any.
All right, and going back to you, Mr. Sampler, you were saying that the infrastructure is built up and, you know, a lot more women are voting, a lot more women are in colleges and school, and that's a good thing. is that going to be sustainable without our presence there? Is that something they believe in philosophically, or is it just an ideological feeling, or not an ideological feeling, but an ideal of ours that we're instilling upon them in a Muslim country that they won't maintain after we leave?
Yeah, Congressman, that's a great question. It's not an issue of Islam, it's more an issue of Afghan society. And it is something that they're adapting as their own. And that's the only way it will be resilient, is if they make it their own philosophy. Increasingly, they
without our presence, though.
Yeah, without our presence. I mean, the Afghans appreciate what we've done for them, but the Afghans themselves want to reach a point where they are self-sufficient and self-sustaining. Not all Afghans see it this way yet, but that's the progress that we're making.
Okay, and you know, we've talked about the poppy fields, how we need to change the farmers and the whole production mechanism so there's a more profitable crop, and get away from $100 million in poppies, yet we're giving $100 million for elections. And we've talked about that for 25, 30 years. I mean, it goes back to 1992. I mean, even before that. That's just a way of life. Is that really realistic that we can change that without just changing the whole dynamics over there as far as the government and the structure and all that, and, you know, Western ideologies?
Congressman, I hate to speak in generalities, but most Afghan farmers don't choose to grow poppies because they want to. They would rather grow food. It's just not profitable, and it's just not sustainable. So our job at USAID is to make it possible for them to make a living off of non-criminal activities.
I appreciate your input. Thank you. I'm out.
Thank you. Thank you. We now go to Lois Frankel of Florida. Representative Frankel's son served in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I did have the privilege of visiting our troops in Afghanistan and our folks from USAID with Mr. Wilson. And I'm glad his son has returned home safely, as have mine. And my son also served in USAID. He went back after the Marines. He went back to Afghanistan. So I thank you all for your service. I'm grateful for his service and everybody's service, but I still have to say that I remain skeptical of the money we're spending there and the waste and the fraud and all that. But with that said, I do have a number of questions. First of all, you talked about education, and it's heartening to hear about the advancement in education. But specifically, I'd like, you know, there's a saying that, I don't know who I'm quoting, but a great teacher under a tree is better than an ignorant one in a new American-built school. So my first question is, what are the metrics that we're using in terms to assess whether there is success? I mean, are there test scores? Is it secular courses? Is there any anti-West propaganda being taught? I mean, what's the metric used? And if the agreement is reached and we do stay there, do you feel that you have a good understanding among all the agencies which groups are significant threats to the United States and which have goals that are only local? And in terms of the various programs, are we going to see the State Department lead on diplomacy, USAID on development, IC on intelligence, or will the military continue to drive those lanes? Those are my basic questions. And if you have time, I'd like to hear also the answer again from some of the others. I think Ambassador Dobbins did answer why we should stay. I'd like to hear the other gentleman's response to that.
You want to start on the education, Larry?
Yeah, sure. On the education, you know, we can measure outputs or outcomes, and I'm very much a proponent of measuring desirable outcomes. And one of the most positive things, I think, in Afghanistan in the recent years is the figure I cited in my testimony. Of Afghans entering higher education, 20% are women. That would be unthinkable even a decade ago because there were no women who had primary or secondary educations. And that's a sustainable achievement. Those women won't be rolled back to burqas. They won't be put back in the back corner of a compound. So in terms of outcomes, that's one of the metrics.
Excuse me, but what are they learning? I'm asking you, do you know when they get through the system what they have learned?
Yeah, Afghanistan has entrance exams for their universities. I'm not familiar with what they are. I have been told by others that they are comparable to other universities in the region, but I can get more information on that if you would like.
Let me just add one point on this, which is twice as many Afghans can read and write today as could 10 years ago. And that number will go up to 3 times as many 10 years from now if the kids in school now stay in school. So at a basic level, literacy is the outcome.
Your other question in terms of anti-Western bias in their education, USAID did a $27 million contract with the Ministry of Education to purchase textbooks. And we did have the right to reviews. That they were Afghan textbooks. They designed the curriculum. We didn't interfere in that, but we were satisfied that it was not prejudicial to the United States or the West.
You want to say something about why we're there?
Yes, ma'am. I appreciate the question of why we're there. I mean, I think this is something that all of the Foreign Service officers have to deal with. Why am I leaving my family and going to do this? I'm struck, given my military time, that we can do this right or we can do it again. And our hope is that we will be able to create and support a secure, stable, and democratic Afghanistan that governs its population justly and secures its geographical space. I use that quite often with new Foreign Service officers going out, and it captures most of what I think are the reasons that we're there.
And ma'am, with respect to the groups that we know are a threat to the U.S. and ones that are local, while we have those identified, there's no guarantee that the ones who are focused on local activities will not merge and compile resources and personnel to attack ourselves or other coalition nations. And that is of concern, is that because some of these groups, they affiliate and they have far-reaching effect than it was ever intended, and we're mindful of that.
And what about driving the various programs? Can somebody answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be fair, I think that there is a division of labor between defense, state, AID, and the intelligence community at the moment that's pretty clear. The collaboration, I've been in every administration since Lyndon Johnson's, and I think the collaboration among agencies is pretty straightforward and pretty amicable. And as good as any administration I've seen. I don't see DOD rolling over the other agencies. I think they're, on the diplomatic side, they're quite a differential to the State Department, and of course we are to them on the military operations side.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Don't know where to begin here. How much are we spending annually in Afghanistan now? How much is the cost to the American taxpayer? Anybody know?
I mean, I think each of us have somewhat different budgets there. The total budget,
Yeah, what would be, nobody knows the total budget, what we're spending in Afghanistan? It's a hearing on Afghanistan. Can I have an estimate?
I'm sorry, Congressman.
Well, I'll just have to say that it's disheartening to have a briefing from our government people who are involved in a project, and they can't tell me how much we're spending annually. And
it is an amount.
How many killed and wounded have we suffered in the last 12 months? Mr. Dumont, would you know that?
Sir, I do not. I'll have to get back with you on that one also.
We don't know what the cost is, and we don't even know how many killed and wounded are. And we're supposed to believe that you fellows have a plan that's going to end up in a positive way in Afghanistan? Holy cow.
We do know that the number of Afghan soldiers and police killed is 30 times the number.
You know what? I'll have to tell you something. I'm more interested in knowing how many Americans have been killed, because the Afghans have been killing themselves for centuries. And, you know, my father fought in Korea, and I remember when he told me, he said, Dana, all of these young men who were with me out fighting in Korea, they would never have believed that we'd be there after 50 years. They never, not one of those guys who went to Korea to try to stop the communist takeover would have believed that that meant that we would have been committed for 50 years. It's, okay, we don't know how many are killed and wounded. We don't know what the cost is. So what will be the cost? You're presenting a plan now. We want us to accept. What will be the cost to the United States per year annually after your plan is applied to Afghanistan, if they accept it?
Well, we haven't defined force levels there. I think the rough figure is probably about $1 million per soldier, so you can work out when you...
And how many soldiers are we asking them, pleading with them to let us send our boys into harm's way? How many soldiers is the plan to continue with our presence?
The President hasn't made that decision yet.
Is there a proposal to Karzai on that?
No, in Karzai...
I heard the number 14,000. Is that out of the ballpark?
If you were talking about a U.S., NATO, everybody together figure, that would still probably be somewhat high. Karzai, in fact, has expressed no interest in the size of the residual presence.
Okay. You know, yesterday the Secretary of State was here, and he was telling me different things of why what we can't do to make the mullahs mad. Of course, he wasn't putting it that way, and I suggested that there was groveling going on. I think we are groveling again. Maybe this is the grovel administration. We are groveling to Karzai. I know Karzai. I've known him for 20 years. And we all, and to suggest his family, we all know what his family's done. They've become filthy rich. And we're dealing with a group there now centered around the Karzai clique. I mean, drug dealing, skimming of U.S. aid, cronyism at its worst, and we're dealing with Pakistan in order to make sure we have a presence there, and we're, meaning in Afghanistan, and the Pakistanis are doing what? We know the Pakistanis are behind the ISI, who they're financing. We know that they spend money that we end up getting from us to kill American soldiers. This is insanity. And then we have people who want to stay longer. It's time for us to get our butts out of that country. Not for their sake, for our sake. We don't even care enough to know how much it's costing or how many killed and wounded that we suffered. That should be right on the tip of your tongue, because that's a cost to everybody's kid. I mean, everybody has got a son there, or has to know that our number one priority is that person who we sent over there. We care about him enough. But we have some other agenda in Afghanistan. I don't see what we're going to accomplish, and you're asking what the goals are. If you believe that that's accomplishable in Afghanistan, I got a bridge to sell you in California. Thank you.
Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, let me just say, I do think, I say to the panel, Mr. Rohrabaugh is right. How you can come to a congressional oversight hearing on this subject with your titles and not know how much we're spending every year and not know how many casualties we incur every year or this last year, I will say to the chairman of this committee, is actually a stunning development. I've been involved in foreign policy hearings and oversight for a long time. Like, that wouldn't be a question on the tip of one's tongue, but put that aside. Mr. Sampler, what's going to happen to the oversight of AID's projects in Afghanistan post-2014? Are you going to have to, is AID going to have to pull back from whole geographic chunks of Afghanistan for want of security?
Congressman, thank you for the question. We hope not, but hope is not a plan. In most countries that we work in around the world, we rely on host national security forces to provide areas that are secure enough for us to work. But there's a range from what I would call regular aid missions, where that's the case, to Afghanistan. And then in between, we have places like Pakistan, Colombia, South Sudan, Yemen, where we have to come up with creative measures to balance normal operations against conflict operations. In Afghanistan post-2014, we've got programs scattered around the country. Some will be able to continue to operate. Some may have to be adjusted. It will depend on the security situation in the specific micro area as opposed to the countrywide.
Are there parts of Afghanistan where you're operating now that, absent something happening, you have to plan for withdrawal or significant curtailment because of want of security, that clearly the Taliban is going to reassert itself in certain sectors of Afghanistan?
Congressman, I can't name a specific area, but categorically I think there certainly must be. There will be some place in Afghanistan that we're working today where a year from now the situation will have changed and we will no longer be able to work.
Yeah.
We'll have to readjust and pull back.
One of the concerns I had when I went to Afghanistan in 2009 was the emergence of SERP as actually sort of a parallel, unregulated, no oversight stream of development assistance, economic assistance funding, entirely controlled by local commanders, our military commanders on the ground. I think it started out with great intentions, but it ballooned. It became fairly substantial. And it always worried me that it didn't get the attention, say, bilateral aid programs do. It's not really, it's kind of ad hoc projectized. It doesn't get the kind of careful scrutiny and evaluation we would normally expect for any kind of normal aid project. What is the status of SERP funding, and are the concerns I had in 2009, do you think they've been resolved or addressed in the interim? And I ask that of any one of the three of you. Sure.
Mike, speak to the current status. Your concerns in 2009 were not unfounded. Commander's Emergency Response Program money was to serve a stabilization goal. And I've been in the military and I've been at USAID, and I can appreciate the value of what they were attempting to do. One of the ways that we, with our DOD colleagues, remedied this was by putting senior development advisors at each of the regional combatant commands and then embedding USAID officers all the way down to the PRT and the district support team level. So from 2007, 8, and 9 to the most recent times, I think we've addressed this. We no longer see CERT programs that don't have a developmental eye cast upon them. Now, that doesn't always mean that CERT programs are what I would consider good long-term development programs, but that's not their goal. Their goal is to satisfy something that that tactical commander needs at that moment, and we tolerate that. We work with CERT to make sure that it integrates into good development, even if at the moment it may not be a developmentally sound project. It does serve a military goal.
Mr. Ambassador, any comment on that?
Well, obviously, SERP is dramatically reduced as a result of the reduction.
I'm sorry, Mr. Ambassador, can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Obviously, SERP is dramatically reduced as the result of the reduction in U.S. forces. And I would guess as we move to a training, advise, and assist role, it will be reduced to virtually zero. So whatever the problem was, I think it'll be resolved in that sense. But I do agree with Mr. Sampler that over time, AID and Defense created a joint mechanism for managing SERP that brought developmental considerations to bear on those expenditures. I might just mention, in response to your early questions about total levels of spending and casualties, that state and AID between them spend about $2 billion a year in Afghanistan. At the moment, it was about double that 2 years ago. Casualties, about 2,200 killed in action since the beginning of the conflict, and about 20,000 injured. As to the cost of the troops, as I said, it's about $1 million a day per troop, so we currently have 50,000 troops there. If that was a constant through the year, it would be $50 billion. It will be less than that because we're bringing those troop numbers way down over the next year.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and I know my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go to Mr. Brad Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll thank the witnesses for your time here, but also critically for the service you give to our country. I want to repeat what some of the sentiment that's already been shared. The supreme disappointment in President Karzai's refusal to sign the bilateral security agreement and his game playing with it at a time, as Ambassador Dobbins, you've said, time is of the essence here. It has a ongoing impact. Being the last one to ask questions, it's a chance to wrap up. But as Ambassador Dobbins, you mentioned the war in Afghanistan is not yet over. And I think, Mr. Sampler, you touched on it and said it most eloquently. We either do it right this time or we do it all over again. And the goal, the reason we have invested so much in blood and treasure is to eliminate a threat, but also long-term to make sure that we have a stable government that is working for the prosperity of its people and justly and regional security. And that's critical. What struck me listening to the testimony today is that a common thread that you all touched on. Mr. Sampler, you said that continued U.S. engagement is critical to Afghanistan's stability and to protecting the vital interests of our own country. And Mr. Dumont, I think you put it a little bit differently, but the ANSF can be a guarantor for a secure and democratic Afghanistan, but not without continued progress towards developing a sustainable and professional force, and I think that requires ongoing support. And finally, Ambassador Dobbins, all recognize that without continued international military and economic support, Afghanistan risks falling back into civil war. So it becomes, in some respect, a self-fulfilling prophecy. As we sit here in December and looking to a new year, we look forward to next summer and the summer fighting season again. So I guess my first question, after a long introduction, and Mr. Dumont, maybe you're the one to look to for this, what do you see as the critical success factors if the ANSF is going to stand up and successfully make it through next summer, and we're going to continue down a path we're hoping to see?
I think there are several things. One is obviously providing for a safe and secure election. They're quite adept at providing a secure environment for voter registration to take place, and there were no significant security interests during that time, and I think that is a good indicator. But their ability to secure the elections will be critical, and what that'll do is that'll enhance their confidence going forward. I also think as we draw down and they realize that there is less coalition presence, how well they continue to take the fight to the insurgents will be key. They've been quite adept at doing it during this fighting season. It's enhanced their confidence tremendously. What is going to be next for the ANSF is the ability to continue to train and equip their troops themselves, the ability to deploy their people where they need them, the ability to sustain their force based on the resources that they get from both donor nations and their own resources. Those will be the key indicators in the months and years ahead.
Mr. Sampler, outside the context of the military and anticipated military challenges next summer, spring with the election, from your standpoint, what are the greatest threats to your ongoing effectiveness in the next 12, 24 months?
It's something that was discussed in the hearing yesterday. I haven't heard it discussed today widely, and it's the hedging behavior of Afghans in the current area or current time of uncertainty and instability. If Afghans have a sense that there is a way forward, and if the elections go well, I think hedging behavior will diminish. But if Afghans feel that the international community is going to walk away from them and leave them to their devices, then hedging behavior will be things like returning to feudal warlords and ethnic warlords, continuing to salt away resources. It will encourage more corruption, not less corruption. So part of our job at USAID will be to encourage them that USAID's engagement in Afghanistan is not a short-term thing. We engage in countries for decades if there is a need and if there is support from the U.S. Congress. Our goal will be to convince the Afghans that we, the U.S., and we, the international community, are here to stay so we can minimize the hedging behavior on behalf of the Afghans.
Does that hedging behavior, I mean, if I'm trying to put it in context, my own mind get around it, does the hedging behavior lead to a more fractious Afghanistan, pulling it further away from that secure, just, increasingly prosperous Afghanistan? Is that the challenge?
Yeah, I think hedging behavior is basically where family and clan leaders decide to focus on protecting their own, so they don't make business investments. They don't reach out to other ethnic groups. Their political decisions are going to be very clan-centric and forward. They'll be more, I think, outgoing and more entrepreneurial.
Good. Thank you. Ambassador Dobbins, I'd hoped to give you the final word, but I ran out of time, so I apologize. But again, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. That's okay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Schneider. Thank you very much for yielding back. We thank our members. We thank also the witnesses for being before us today. As we saw in Afghanistan early this morning, another car bomb exploded, this one outside the northern gate of the Kabul International Airport. And the Taliban claimed responsibility for this attack. Those carrying out the attacks had ties to the Haqqani network. In terms of the amount spent per month in Afghanistan, it's about $6.7 billion by the United States, and this committee has oversight over this issue. I want to again thank the witnesses for their testimony today, but as you know, there were a number of questions asked by committee members. If you can get back to those members with written answers to anything not asked today, and there will be some additional questions forthcoming from members of the committee. Thank you again for your testimony, and we stand adjourned.